Hello, welcome to this, the 7th of my videos introducing the basic ideas of Marx and Marxism. And this is the second one devoted to the question of Marx's theory of history or historical materialism. In the first on historical materialism, I explained the basics of the theory, that it begins with the labour of the mass of ordinary people on nature and how that is organised. It leads to a conception of there being an economic base to society and a political ideological superstructure, and an argument that society develops through the expansion of its productive forces, which also come into conflict with the social relations of production, and that leads on to social revolution through a process of class struggle. Now, historical materialism has been a guide to action, a guide to analysis and action for the Marxist movement for the last 150 years, and it's also been the basis for a whole number of outstanding works of actual history. Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, James Connolly's Labour in Irish History, C.L.R. James' The Black Jacobins, the study of the slave revolt in Haiti, E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, and many other classic historical studies. But throughout this time, the main criticism of historical materialism as an explanation of history, especially in academic circles, is that it overestimates the role of the economy. Indeed, it's often presented as a theory of mechanical economic determinism, that economics explains everything that goes on in history and in society. Indeed, it has to be recognised that sometimes would-be Marxists have interpreted the theory this way and espoused some form or other of economic determinism. But in fact, this is a substantial misinterpretation. It's a major mistake. And interestingly, Engels, at the end of his life, wrote a whole series of letters in which he pointed out that this was not what he and Marx ever intended. He explained that they had to emphasize the economic factor because it was neglected by everybody else or ignored by all in all the previous sort of explanations of history, but that they were not saying more than that was the foundation, that was the basis from which you departed, and they were not at all denying the role of politics or ideas or organization or even religion and so on, and that all these developed a certain autonomy and reflected back on and influenced the real course of development. Engels, for example, he made these points again and again, but I'll quote them so you hear what he said. He said, "The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, juridical forms, and even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas, also exercise their influence on the course of the historical struggles. There is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accidents, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary." So it's a very complicated, dialectical, as Engels says, process. And we must remember here that Marxism is a theory of class struggle and revolution. Let's take the example of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, from the feudal mode of production that prevailed in the Middle Ages to modern capitalism. The foundation of this transition was that capitalism as a way of producing develops within feudalism, and the whole process would not have been possible if it were not for the fact that capitalism was a more productive economic system than feudalism, that it yielded a higher productivity of labour, and that made it possible for it to supplant feudalism. But the actual process itself was not at all a gradual, purely economic one. Not at all something that happened smoothly or evenly. On the contrary, it was several hundred years of wars and revolutions. Can go back to the Reformation with Martin Luther that I spoke about in the last session, the Counter-Reformation, reaction by the feudal aristocracy and the church to try and prevent the changes of the Reformation. You can see the Dutch Revolt in the 16th and beginning of the 17th century, the English Civil War, English Revolution of 1642, the American Revolution, finally the French Revolution of 1789, and so on. And in these struggles and wars, there were also many, so-called religious wars, but were really part of this process. That in these revolutions and wars, that ideas, political organisation, and even individual leaders all played an important role. For example, in the Reformation, you have to see the role played by Martin Luther, and perhaps even more importantly by John Calvin, and the role of Protestantism in encouraging the development of capitalism. In the 18th century, you can see the tremendously important role of the philosophes, the French philosophes of the Enlightenment, Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau, and so on, in preparing the way for the French Revolution and in influencing the people who carried the French Revolution out. You see again in the role of organisation, you can see the new model army created by Cromwell and its role in defeating Charles I in the English Revolution. You can see the role of the Jacobins in the French Revolution, and as I said, even individual leaders like the personality of Cromwell and his determination made a difference, as did, what's often called the fanaticism, but the revolutionary enthusiasm of someone like Robespierre. So the whole process was not at all automatic, and at various points it could have been halted or turned back. Indeed, there were many setbacks in the process of transition from feudalism to capitalism. So it was not smooth, it was not inevitable, it was not simple. And the same thing applies to the question of the socialist revolution as well. When we look at the Russian Revolution, the one real example we have of a socialist revolution so far, what do we find? We find that it had profound roots in the development of Russian society, profound economic and social roots in the way in which capitalism was developing within the increasingly outdated framework of Tsarism, how Tsarism was going into decay, how both the bourgeoisie were developing, but even more strongly, the Russian working class was developing, and how the crisis of Russian society came to the fore within the First World War, and the working class moved onto the stage, overthrowing the Tsar, more or less spontaneously, and so on. So we can see all of this had profound economic and social roots. But it's also true that the fact that there existed a powerful socialist organisation, revolutionary socialist organisation, the Bolsheviks, made an immense difference in the fact that that revolution turned into the October Revolution, the socialist revolution. The working class was able to take power. And even within that, we can say, and Trotsky in his great History of the Russian Revolution that I mentioned points this out, within that, Lenin himself made several decisive interventions, including persuading the leadership of the Bolshevik Party to launch the insurrection in October 1917. So Lenin was only the last link in a long chain that goes back into the class struggle and into Russian history, but that last link was extremely important. And so that gives you an idea of the fact that it's a mechanical distortion of Marxism to think of it as a simple theory of economic determinism in which the productive forces determine everything and shape everything else. Not at all. But having said that, and that's extremely important because that, revolutionary activity, political activity in general, would be a waste of time. Having said that, also have to say that you can go too far with this idea of the autonomy and of political forces and so on, to a point where you get back to where the old bourgeois theories of history, in which it's all about individuals and ideas and so on, and we lose sight of the economic foundations. And I think that the fact that in the end the course of history is shaped by the masses, and that even before that we have the question of the relationship between human beings and nature, and human labour and nature as the foundation for the whole process, that the fact of climate change, the awesome fact of climate change, is something that serves to remind us of that. But again, say overcoming the crisis of climate change will involve struggle, it will involve organisation, and it will involve revolutionary leadership. So that is, again, even in its more complicated and developed form, historical materialism leads us back to the question of revolution.